Introducing our department head, Paula Shine, and she's going to bring a quick welcome before we introduce Darrell Morris.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Good to see many known faces and new ones. I wanted to say a word first about our new department. As some of you might know, we have combined the Department of Elementary Education with Curriculum and Instruction to create this new department, which is called Teacher Education and Learning Sciences. I can't tell you how excited we are about it, but I think one of the parts that I think it's working the best, don't say that, someone else will be, you don't think my part is working, but I think the literacy part, for me, is very exciting. We had a literacy group in Curriculum and Instruction. We had a literacy group in elementary education, and now I think they all have a chance to work together, really thinking about literacy, reading, English language arts across K-12. So I think this has really strengthened our group. We are a group with very diverse expertise. So I'm excited to be able to be department head for this group. So it's my honor to be here today. Thank you, Hiller, for inviting me. Thank you, Darrell, for being here. And Hiller will introduce the speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Paula. Let's give her a round of applause. It's good to have department heads show up to our events. We like that. So we are thrilled to have Darrell Morris, who is a professor at Appalachian State University. He has been there for 26 years, and he is the guru for reading clinics and for early prevention of early reading failure. So we are thrilled to have him here tonight to share his wisdom, to get us motivated and psyched up, and to share what he's learned over the years in terms of the research and the practice that he has been conducting. So without further ado, I'm going to invite Darrell to come and talk to us. Thank you, Darrell. Thank you for being here.
It's kind of ironic, me presenting at a group that's called New Literacies. As some of my friends in here will know, and the gray hair, I'm kind of an old literacy person. But I checked with Hiller, and she said that no, New Literacies takes in the whole gamut, so maybe I'm safe with that. I actually grew up near here. I went to Cary Elementary School, which was then called Cary High School, which was a 1 to 12 school in 2 buildings back in the 50s, and went first through 6th grade. And Cary was 5,000 people, and it was 8 miles from Raleigh, and it was pure fields. So change does happen. Now, I'm going to give you a little bit of background about me because you need some context to understand what I'm going to be talking about tonight. I'm a university-based reading clinic director. And what that means is, to me, is I try to teach teachers how to work effectively with struggling readers, beginning readers and older kids. I've been doing it a long time. I've been at Appalachian for 26 years. And I was in a small school in Chicago 10 years previous to that. Now, I'm talking about some things now because there's going to be a question and answer period, and who knows, you may not be that interested in my talk, but I'll take any questions that you have about the topics that I'm going to mention now. I'm real interested in assessment issues in beginning reading, and as you know, that's a big thing in our state right now. My research has been in the area of beginning reading. I like working with kids, which is a bit unusual for college professors. And I come from a long tradition, a really long tradition of reading educators that are interested in clinical work. These traditions are disappearing in our field. And the names I'm going to mention will only be familiar to those of you who've got a few gray hairs. My mentor was Ed Henderson at the University of Virginia. And that was a good while back. All of these people are dead now. Ed's teacher was Russell Stauffer at University of Delaware. Some of you may have heard of the DRTA. He was the guy that did that. He also repopularized the language experience approach. which is kind of disappearing also. And Stauffer's mentor, and this one may ring home with a few of you, was Emmett Betts at the Temple University in Philadelphia. Betts is the guy that came up with the informal reading inventory. So this thing goes way back, and I actually felt that my training was so strong and so relevant that I've researched some of these old ideas over the years. Doesn't necessarily help you get in journals, but I think keeping these ideas alive is very important. Along with the work I've had with teachers and kids in a reading clinic, I also had one other thing that profoundly influenced the way I look at beginning reading and training teachers. And that was for 17 years, it was about 1986 to 2003, I did early intervention work all over the country. I worked in about 9 different states. I took many more plane trips than I ever want to think about doing. And I would travel out to these schools and visit with teachers who were working one-to-one with kids who were having trouble 6 to 8 times a year. Now, again, this is 12 years ago when I quit doing this. The influence on me was the Reading Recovery Program, which some of you may be familiar with. Maury Clay's program about working with struggling readers was really was kind of revolutionary. It came over the United States and actually had a pretty good run. It lasted for about 15 years, and now it's disappearing. But Clay came up with some ideas that I thought were very important. One, she said, and anybody ought to realize this, unless we start getting this reading problem at the beginning, early on, it's never going to disappear. You've got to catch kids before they fall behind. The notion of letting them get to 3rd grade and then running reading camps in 3rd grade really is absurd. You've got to start earlier than that, kindergarten or 1st grade. Clay also said that it has to be intensive. The kids that come from poor circumstances or disadvantaged populations, haven't had a lot of literacy in the home, you've got to make that up somehow. And the other kids aren't going to sit there and say, hey, come on and catch up with us. As soon as they hit school, they're going to take off, and these kids have a trajectory, they fall further and further behind. So she introduced the idea of one-to-one tutoring. It's expensive, but she felt it had to be that intensive. And the third was you needed carefully trained teachers. And my experience kind of backs this up. I feel that we do a pretty good job at the undergraduate level of teaching kids about how schools work, what a basic reader is, or what leveled books are. They learn a lot about, and then they go out to teach. And if they've got teacher inside of them and they want to do it, they'll be able to teach most of the kids how to read. If we weren't teaching most of the kids how to read, there would be a revolution in the country, right? But there's always been a large percentage, 30%, 25, 30% on average, higher than that in disadvantaged populations, kids who struggle. We can't do that at the undergraduate level. You can't talk to kids in a classroom 60 minutes, 2 or 3 courses, and expect them to have that kind of expertise. And Clay knew that. So I took her program, some concepts of it, and I don't believe, they copyrighted the whole thing and all that. I don't pay any attention to that. I don't believe you copyright ideas. I believe you put ideas out there, people change them, work with them, publish their results, whatever. And I kept part of her program and then added some of our own stuff to it that I'd learned at Virginia. Now, the reason I mention that, you're going to see that affected what I'm going to talk to you about tonight, the content. And this talk is based, actually I wrote an article in the Reading Teacher last spring. And it's funny, as you get older, I can't run anymore, but I walk a lot. And as I was walking, I was thinking through some of these issues. And then I wrote the article in a couple of days. It just wasn't that hard to write. It was already in my mind what I wanted to say. But that's what I want to take you through. And it's what would we need to do to really prevent reading failure in the primary grades. Now let me start by saying there's always been controversy in the field of beginning reading. Our field doesn't have, we've got an ahistorical perspective. It's What's happened the last 5 years, what's hot, that's what we know. But people have been wrestling with this problem for 100 years. I'm not going back 100 years, I used to, but I'm going to save you that, and we'll start with the 80s. 35 years ago, 1980. What you taught kids with in the 80s in terms of materials was called a combination basal reader. They had strict word control. It was kind of like Dick and Jane, but they substituted the boy and girl, they put bears and animals in there for political correctness, but it was the same thing, just repeated the words over and over again. And then they had a heavy phonics component too. So it was lots of word control, kind of senseless stories in the early levels, and a lot of phonics. Then in the 1990s, there really was a revolution. And again, I don't know how many people are in here that remember that, but it was called whole language. Whole language really did turn the tables on a tradition that had been there, because I said the 80s were the basal readers. They went back to the 30s. So we had been doing pretty much the same thing for about 60 years. Whole language questioned the very basic premises of that basal reader approach, word control and phonics. First of all, they said you don't need word control, not much anyway. What you need is authentic literature, good authors. If we're going to put, I'll give you an example. In the old days, if they were going to take a frog and toad story, they took it, they got permission, probably paid thousands of dollars to change the story so it had a lot of word control. Once whole language came in, nope, the original story goes in the basal reader. Doesn't matter if there's a lot of words in there that kids might not be familiar with at that level. We want the authentic literature. So word control kind of went out. They didn't believe in phonics either. They said that phonics was boring, that you really didn't learn to read with phonics, that wasn't all that important. And if you were going to teach it, you needed to teach it in the context of reading. So a kid would be reading a story and you would stop and maybe point out some principles of phonics. You can do that with consonants, but that doesn't work real good with vowels. So now those are the reading things whole language did. It did some good things too. It believed in teachers making decisions, which is going to be one of the themes I'm going to talk about tonight. It didn't believe in just putting programs and having technicians run kids through programs. It believed teachers had to make decisions. It actually believed in writing, a really strong writing approach too, that writing ought to be a big part of early literacy. But if you take its reading components, the lack of word control and eliminating phonics, particularly for kids who needed it, it ran into trouble. And whole language really lasted about 10 years. It was over by the end of the 1990s. Now, why did it go away? There were two reasons it went away. One was the test scores dropped. When you stopped teaching kids the code at all and expected just good literature to naturally take its place and kids would just learn to read that way, the way they learn how to talk. Reading's not like learning how to talk. It's very different. So when the test scores dropped, people started wondering about it. The second reason it went under, and this is probably more important, there were scientists then, cognitive psychologists, who were studying the reading process. The feds were funding careful research by very bright people into how does the reading process work in the mind, both for the fluent reader and for the younger reader. And they reached a consensus that word knowledge was very, very important. Good readers have very quick, accurate, automatic word recognition, and that has to be developed in the lower grades. So these researchers started talking to the government started talking to them. The government went to whole language and said, what do you have to say about this? The whole language people, they weren't real big on research. So they lost that battle, and they lost it big, and you're still feeling the results of that. George Bush went into office, and we got reading first, No Child Left Behind. Again, time flies, that was 15 years ago. What it said in No Child Left Behind that changed reading instruction in this country was that if you receive federal money, and who doesn't anymore, for your Title I population, your schools have to use phonics-based or scientifically based reading instruction, which was you have to use phonics. And that's when it really came in. The other thing that most states did, because they were worried about accountability, they dropped first grade reading down into kindergarten. And that happened around 2000, same time. We started making kindergarten classes look like first grade classes up until that point. And you took the phonics and you pushed it right back down into kindergarten. So those are the three changes in 35 years that are huge. From whole word based instruction supplemented by phonics, to whole language, which didn't believe in word control or phonics, to a real phonics emphasis. Now, I can't talk about Raleigh. I don't know what's going on down here. If you know where Boone is, we're in the corner of the state. And I have some influence in the western counties, but not down this far. It's about 3 hours away. But I'm telling you, kindergarten and first grade classrooms in the western part of the state, it's phonics in kindergarten and continued on into first grade with programs like Letterland, Foundations, and yeah, we'll go on. All right. Now, what I want to do is not just be negative the whole time, because that's not what the talk is about. There's plenty to be negative about. But what can we learn from these changes? What can we learn? And this is the insight that I had that I think was an insight anyway. One is things haven't gotten better for low reading kids. With those big changes, we still have one teacher in the classroom. We still got too many kids for her to work with. We're starting to take some of the aids away. The scores haven't improved. The NAEP scores are fairly flat. Now, some just came out recently that said fourth grade has gone up by 4%, but I would want to know where that 4% was. Was that at the bottom? Was it in the middle? Was it at the top? Across the country, it isn't changing. The second thing, though, is could you look at the history and come up with some things that we have learned? So now I want to get a little bit more positive. Actually, I think you can look at those instructional approaches that I just talked about and take something from each one. And if you take something from each one, which is kind of hard to do, and put it into a new whole, you've got something that makes sense. In a way, it's like the, I don't know what the exact adage is, but the 4 blind men and the elephant, and one's got the trunk, and one's got the leg, and one's got an ear. They've each got a part of it, but they have no idea what they're holding on to. I think that's what we've got. And if we could put these things together, it might work. At least it has worked for me. So here's my argument. When the article came out in Reading Teacher, the editor said in the introduction, they said, Morris has got an interesting paper here. He puts forth a simple 3-point program, but we question whether it's that simple or not to do it, which it was kind of a backhanded compliment. It's not simple what I'm going to be telling you, but it is 3 points, okay? It is 3 points. The first, I think, necessary thing, and this is where we've made some progress, we need an interesting, carefully leveled book curriculum in every kindergarten and first grade program. Interesting is important. Dick and Jane wasn't interested. Intensive phonics isn't interesting to 5-year-olds. But there are some materials out there now that have been written, most of them are written, didn't come from the United States, started off in New Zealand, that have some real potential. And these books would go from A, Bowness and Pinnell, to I or J, into first grade. Second, we need a leveled phonics program. You say, oh yeah, we got plenty of those. You do. But I'm talking about a reasonable phonics program that teaches content in a reasonable sequence and works for mastery at each level before you run kids through the next. And 3, schools need some teacher training capability, which they don't have. We need some way to take young teachers who are thrown into classrooms or hired to teach a classroom, who've had a couple classes in undergraduate, and a way to train them to understand how the beginning process works with a struggling reader. And essentially that means, how do you move kids through that book curriculum and through that phonics curriculum skillfully? So I'm going to take up each of those points now. Now, what about level books? Actually, we've always had ways of leveling beginning reading material. I mean, you can't put first graders in Shakespeare, right? It's got to start easy and then you got to move up. The whole word method did that by repeating words over and over again, a select number of words over and over until the kids had a basic sight vocabulary. The whole language movement did that by taking pattern books or language experience stories, so they were working more with a whole and having the teacher read the text to them and have the kids go back and choral read it, and then they finally read it themselves. And the phonics intensive method teaches the letters, the sounds, how to blend them, and then puts the kids in decodable text where they're reading words that match that, and then they gradually move them forward. But the problems with each of those methods alone. Now here's where I think we've made some progress with the books. And I bought a lot of them up in our reading clinic at ASU. And we use them in the schools in the western part of the state. There was an article I read about 10 years ago, written by somebody from this area, Jim Cunningham, who used to teach at Carolina. It was Cunningham and 3 of the graduate students that he was working with. And it was in a nondescript book, series of professional chapters that probably wasn't read by 35 people in the country. But Jim's article really caught my attention, the argument that he laid out. He was saying, what would be the optimal type of text for beginning readers? And he really made 4 points. He said, first, we do need word frequency. This was just after whole language, right? We do need word frequency, words being repeated that were of high frequency. So children learned of and was and for and but by seeing them over and over again in text. He said there should be some decodable patterns in the text. So if you're teaching phonics, the kids do see some words that work like that. If you're only working with of and were and the, it doesn't do any good to be able to go at. You've got to have some words in the text where they can use their decoding skills. The third one was the one that got me. I'm an old language experience person. And one of the things that you learn when you're teaching kids with dictated stories is that they've got a memory for the story, and as they begin to read it back, they gather some momentum. And they kind of know what's there, and they're able to anticipate what the next word is going to be. And the way Cunningham and his colleagues put it, we need text that leads children to read beyond the word. Synthetic phonics doesn't do that. What the kids do is they read a word, they come to the next word and they sound that one out, they come to the next word, they sound that one out. He's talking about you've got some momentum going and you're anticipating the next word, and then there it is. And then the fourth thing he pointed out, it would help if the stories were interesting to the kids that they were reading them. Now, what did he say about phonics? Well, no, he's talking about text. He's not talking about phonics, but his take on phonics, I think, is exactly right. You teach phonics over here separately. You teach it skillfully and you teach it to mastery, and then you let the kids read real stories and write real text, and that's where they practice the phonics skills that they've learned here. Now, as much as I liked what he said, there weren't many books out there that work like that. That's a hard thing to do. That's why we've always had one piece of the elephant. It's hard to have stories that repeat high-frequency words enough, have some decodable words, lead the child to anticipate upcoming words as he reads, and are interesting. But I think there's some out there now, and there probably are going to be more. And the ones that I'm going to mention, and I have no stock in this company and no financial agreement with this company, are the Rigby PM readers. They're the gold standard as far as I'm concerned. They're expensive as hell, as you would expect. Too expensive for most school districts, local school districts where I live, but they're good. They've got a writer who wrote a lot of those stories, particularly levels like, in your jargon, C, see, I'm still back in pre-primer, primer 1, C to G, that first grade level where you have to learn something. A lady who wrote a lot of those books is called Beverly Randell. I didn't know who she was. and I don't usually look up children's authors, but I was using one of these stories in my books, and I had to get permission to use it. So I looked her up on the Wikipedia, because you can find anybody there. Turns out this lady's 84 years old. She's from New Zealand. She was a first grade teacher her whole career, primary grade teacher in New Zealand, but she was an English major in college, and probably a good one. And she just got fed up with teaching kids from books that she didn't think were of high quality in terms of children's interest. So when she retired, she made it her life's duty to write books that told an interesting story that had a beginning, a middle, and an end, and that had decent language. She's been knighted by the New Zealand government for contributions to literature for that. It's really an amazing thing she's done. Now, I'm just going to give you an example. And actually, this is one from Rigby PM that she didn't write, but it makes the case. It's a little story, level 6, I see, F in your thing. So this is early primer, about midway through first grade. This is a long way from C, Dick, run, CC, up, spot, up. Now, she's got more words to work with at primer, but it's a little story. It starts off, pictures play well into these things. It's got a moving van, and it looks like they're moving furniture. And the name of the story is Tiger Runs Away. And those of you who teach early readers know that you do a little picture walk, and you get the kids to talk about what they think the story's going to be about, and then you go back. Now, if you're working with the low group, they might not be able to read all this text, so the teacher might have to read the first page to them. So it goes like this. I want you to listen to the length of the sentences and think about the vocabulary. "This is your new home, Tiger," said Rebecca to her cat. "You will like it here." But Tiger did not like the new house, or the new house. And the teacher would talk about they just moved to a new house and they took their kitten with them. Okay, now, whether the teacher's reading or kid's reading now, it did not look like his old house, and it did not smell like his old house. He jumped away from Rebecca and ran out the door. "Tiger, come back," said Rebecca. "Mom, Tiger's got out. He's run away," said Rebecca. "Mom, come and help me find him." They looked in the garden, and they looked up and down the road, but Tiger had gone. They looked for Tiger again all the next day, but they did not find him. Now, I'm not going to tell you the whole story because, I got other things I want to talk about. But they found him when they went back to their old house, okay? And Tiger made his way about 2 miles over to the old house. They had to take a car to get there, and she found him in the backyard. Now, I know that's a good story. You know why? Because when I was a graduate student up in Charlottesville, we moved a mile away from one apartment to the other with a cat that I loved called Blackberry, that I could hang upside down by his legs, an old tomcat that I'd never had spayed. And that cat disappeared. He went right back a mile away to the old house and refused to come over to the new one until we moved. I want you to listen to some of these sentences. Beginning reading material is often made up of text where you have a formula to drive the sentence. "We will have to go back to the old house to get it today." 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 words in a sentence. Frog and Toad stuff, Arnold Bell stuff, same way. They break those rules about writing to a formula. Listen to this one, one sentence. "They looked for Tiger again all the next day, but they did not find him." Another 15-word sentence. That's what allows kids to read past the word and anticipate what's coming. It's got some natural syntax to it. And look at these words. Think about the 200 most frequent words in the English language. Him, find, not, did, they, but, next, all, the, looked, for, again. They're all Dolch words. This stuff's good. It's real good. It's giving kids the feeling of reading for meaning, enjoying a story, and they're learning words. All right, just a word about levels. First grade books have always been leveled Up until the 80s, there were 5 levels in first grade, 3 paperback pre-primers, then a hardback primer, and a late first grade. What Fountas and Pinnell did, that industry that they run, they've made 9 levels. Heck, one time Reading Recovery had 16 levels. That was crazy, right? North Carolina had 16 levels. Now it's got back to 9. 9's about right. 5 was too few, and what 9 has done is it's given you, for a first grader, you've got smaller gradations, gaps between levels. So it makes it easier to move a child forward or a group of children forward when they're ready to move. So that's another plus, I think. Okay, so enough about books. What about phonics, that leveled phonics curriculum I talked about? Well, first of all, teachers need to understand what they're teaching. They need, and it's not the most enjoyable thing to learn when you're an undergraduate, phonics rules. But they need to know the basic content of phonics. And luckily, the field agrees on what the basic content is. There's not a disagreement on what kids need to learn in phonics. There's even pretty good agreement on what they should be taught first, what next, and what next. And in first grade, you start with beginning consonants. That's the most powerful cue for beginning readers. You move to short vowels. Right when you're doing short vowels or just after it, you start to introduce consonant clusters, blends and digraphs, and then you end up with long vowels and R-control vowels contrasted with short vowels. That's the end. A good first grade reader knows all that, but that's a lot. That's a lot. And what happens to slow kids who are slow to taking on to reading? I don't mean slow intellectually, I just mean kids that are having a hard time grasping phonics principles. The curriculum is taught, and up where I'm at, it's taught whole group, so the teacher's pacing a whole group, and some kids, they're not learning what they need to learn as the teacher goes through it. So you get to beginning consonants, and then the teacher moves the middle of the group up to short vowels, and you got 4 or 5 kids in there who don't have beginning consonants. They're lost. They can't go anywhere. And then it keeps moving on them. So somehow you've got to get it so that the children master one level before they're introduced to the next, and you stay there till they get it. And you say, well, God, that's asking the teacher a lot. Listen, ask a 4th grade teacher what she does with a kid who comes up and doesn't know phonics. She says that was their job. I'm not teaching phonics. If they don't get that stuff in kindergarten, 1st and 2nd grade, they're never going to get it because nobody's going to teach it to them again. It's very important that it be taught well and taught to mastery as they move through. And by the way, this is an important point. The goal of phonics is not to teach kids to sound out words or to spout rules. The goal of phonics is that last stage that I talked about, those one-syllable vowel patterns, hat, make, hard, male, that they be able to read those words quickly, not sounding them out. In fact, you can't even sound out male. You can't even sound out take. You have to know those patterns as wholes. All right, what about method? If we agree on the content that should be taught, what do you use for method? There are actually 2 basic methods, and they've been around for 100 years, fighting with each other. And the method that dominated throughout the 20th century was called analytic phonics, which is you work with whole words and have kids examine and contrast the parts of the words. Those of you who are familiar with the program Words Their Way, that's a kind of analytic phonics program. You're comparing and contrasting patterns. Now, a strength of analytic phonics is that it does attend to wholes, whole words. So if a kid is grasping it, he's able to read these things as wholes. A weakness is some low readers need to go back to the sounds, the individual letter sounds, and examine them and then begin to chunk them. So if you're using an analytic approach, if a kid's not getting it, you've got to go back and you've got to work synthetically a little bit. The other method is called synthetic phonics, and that's what seems to be popular today. Synthetic phonics doesn't start with the wholes. It starts with the letters, individual letters, and the sounds that go with them. The kids learn those, and then they teach them to blend them together. So if a child sees sat, he goes s, at, t. The strength of that is it gets right down to the alphabetic code real quickly. Another strength is you see a kid being able to decode words pretty fast. A weakness, and this is a big weakness, potentially, is that some kids, especially the slow kids for taking reading, getting into reading, tend to lock in to the sounded out approach, and they tend to sound out everything they see. Kindergarten, first grade, and second grade, and they don't see words as wholes, and you can't move forward in reading like that. So you could use either approach, but if you teach analytically, you've got to you've got to account for those children who are having trouble doing that and go back to the individual. If you teach synthetically, starting with the parts, you've got to make sure that eventually those kids get some experience seeing those words as wholes. Now, if you're thinking to yourself, well, how do you do that? One easy way to start to get them to start helpfully to see words as wholes is to let them read when they're in kindergarten out of books that are at the right level. There's also, and I've seen this with some teachers I've worked with in some interventions, there's also a rationale that you could start synthetically, teaching the beginning consonants and short vowels and how to blend those, and then move to chunks analytically after that. So that's another approach that you could possibly use. All right, we've talked about leveled books, we've talked about phonics, but using leveled books and using phonics implies balance. Notice that whole language didn't have balance. It was missing the phonics component. The synthetic programs I see in kindergartens up in my area, they lack balance because there's so much emphasis on the decoding, the kids aren't getting any chance to read. You've got to have balance. And a balanced lesson plan is not hard to come from. And the one I'm going to put forth to you has 3 parts, and this is fairly simple. Now, this assumes that the teacher's got books that are appropriate. The balanced lesson plan has 3 parts. The first part, and this could be done with individual kids or in a small group, the kids reread 3 books individually. They've got 3 books in front of them. They come up to the teacher, and they reread those books, and she watches and helps them when they need help. You could also pair the kids and have them partner read the books, but they're rereading those books. The second activity is a phonics activity, and the level of phonics they would be working on depends on how strong a reader they are. Some kids will be working on beginning consonants, in another group they'll be working on short vowels, in another group they'll be working on patterns. And the third part of the lesson is you introduce a new book, just like this one. You introduce this book, you have the kids talk about what's going on, you have them work on comprehension as they're moving through it. This book that was introduced that day is then one of the 3 books that's reread the next day. It's that simple. That's the reading recovery plan. That's the part it will be a darn shame as that program disappears if we don't remember how powerful that is. That notion of rereading books drives confidence, it drives sight vocabulary development, and it drives fluency. Now, Clay didn't have a phonics component. That's what we put in. But that phonics component teaches the kid the code, and then they can use it as they read. And introducing the new book means constantly you're feeding in new material every day as they move through. I want to point out that I'm not presenting this as a one-to-one plan only, although it's the best intervention you could do with slow readers, but it could be used in the classroom by kindergarten, first, and second grade teachers. All right. So I just told you about the plan. Does that solve it? You got a 3 plan? If it solved it, then you'd be taking the same position the reading teacher editors did. That's pretty simple. Let's just do that. There's a big difference in a teacher knowing about something and a teacher knowing how to do it effectively. When you take these what do they call them? What's the test? Praxis test. ASU made me take one of those 10 years ago, or they were going to defund the School of Education. I swore I never would do it, but the dean came down and told me he'd give me $500 if I'd take it. So I took it. It took me an hour and a half to take the darn thing. But it just asked me about stuff in reading. Do you know about this? What are the 3 cueing systems? Blah, blah, blah. You know, how do you, what is, and I said, this isn't what teaching's about. Teachers can study a book and memorize stuff and answer questions on a test like that. Teaching is when you've got a group of kids around you can't read and you know how to make it happen. And that's not going to happen just by me going over a lesson plan with you. You've got to experience it. So the goal is clear. How do you move kids from not being able to read through the year to move them through a phonics sequence and through a book level sequence? It can be accomplished, but I think the teachers are going to need some guided training to be able to do it. And now we're getting into the level where, you know, you say, well, this isn't going to happen anytime soon. And you're probably right in North Carolina. But it has happened before, and it could happen again. The type of training that's needed is a practicum. It's what I learned back at UVA, it's what Clay developed in New Zealand, and it's what I teach now to my kids up at ASU. The teacher in training works with a struggling reader, struggling beginning reader, one-to-one. And there's somebody there, a coach. It could be a professor, it could be a reading teacher, it could be a reading specialist, it could be a good classroom teacher who knows how to do it. And she's observed. And that coach can watch like 4 or 5 different pairs at the same time, but you can't watch more than that. You can't have a reading practicum where you say, well, I've got 13 students in this class.